The compound outside Kandahar sat like a fortress carved from the desert itself. Mud brick walls, 3 feet thick, surrounded a maze of courtyards where Mullah Omar, the one-eyed shepherd who became supreme commander of the faithful, knelt in prayer. The evening call to Maghrib echoed across the barren landscape, carried by winds that had witnessed empires rise and fall for millennia. Omar believed, with absolute certainty, that Afghanistan would bury the Americans just as it had buried the Soviets, the British, and every other foreign army foolish enough to march into these mountains. Inside the compound's war room, a converted storage chamber lit by kerosene lamps, senior Taliban commanders gathered around maps hand-drawn on butcher paper. Mullah Omar, a brutal tactician who'd lost a leg fighting the Northern Alliance, jabbed his finger at positions marked in Pashto script. "The Americans will come through Bagram," he said, his voice gravelly from years of battlefield smoke. "We hold the passes. We hold the high ground. Let them come." Omar's military doctrine was simple, almost medieval. Control the terrain, make the enemy bleed for every valley, every ridge. It had worked against the Soviets in the 1980s when Stinger missiles and guerrilla ambushes turned Soviet armor into burning coffins along mountain roads. The Americans, Omar believed, were even softer, a nation of comfort, unwilling to sacrifice, incapable of enduring the kind of protracted warfare that Afghanistan demanded. He had seen their television shows, heard reports of their sensitivity to casualties. One helicopter down, a few body bags, and they would retreat like they did in Somalia. What Omar didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the war had already begun, and it wasn't happening on the ground. 300 miles above the Hindu Kush, a constellation of satellites tracked every radio transmission, every vehicle movement, every heat signature across Taliban-controlled territory. At Bagram Air Base, hastily reoccupied by U.S. Special Forces, CIA paramilitary officers were coordinating with Northern Alliance warlords, men who knew every goat trail and smuggling route in the country. And circling in the thin air at 40,000 feet, invisible to the naked eye and inaudible from the ground, a fleet of B-52 stratofortresses. Cold War relics repurposed for a new kind of war, waited for coordinates. Major Rick Lawson sat in the cockpit of Wrath of God, a B-52H that had flown missions over Iraq during Desert Storm. The aircraft, built in 1962, was older than most of the crew operating it. But its bomb bay carried something the Soviets never had. Joint direct attack munitions, GPS-guided bombs that could hit a target the size of a pickup truck from 8 miles up. Lawson checked his instruments, the green glow of the cockpit displays reflecting off his visor. The targeting data was still downloading. Latitude, longitude, elevation, priority level. Somewhere below, intelligence analysts were triangulating Taliban command posts using intercepted radio chatter and signals intelligence. The Taliban communicated openly, arrogantly, believing their enemies couldn't understand Pashto or intercept their frequencies. They were wrong. Back in Kandahar, Omar's commanders debated strategy over green tea and naan bread. Reports had come in of strange aircraft, high altitude, unmarked, but no bombs had fallen yet. The Northern Alliance, their longtime enemies, were mobilizing the North, but they were fractured, disorganized, dependent on outdated Soviet equipment. Taliban intelligence, such as it was, consisted of informants, rumors, and intercepted radio chatter. They had no satellites, no drones, no real-time surveillance. Their view of the battlefield was limited to what they could see with binoculars or hear over static-filled radios. "The Americans fear our mountains," said Mullah Akhtar, a veteran of the Soviet War who wore a Soviet officer's belt as a trophy. "They will send proxies. They will bomb from a distance. But they will not fight us face to face." The room murmured in agreement. Omar nodded slowly, his single eye, his right had been lost to shrapnel in the 1980s, scanning the faces of his men. Faith, terrain, and patience. These were the pillars of Taliban strategy. They had outlasted the Soviets by bleeding them slowly, ambush by ambush, over 10 years. The Americans, they believed, lacked the stomach for such a war. But 20,000 feet above them, the invisible machinery of American air power was coming online. At Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, drone operators were beginning their shifts, staring at screens showing real-time infrared footage of Afghanistan. At CENTCOM headquarters in Tampa, Florida, targeting officers were building kill chains, the bureaucratic term for process of identifying, tracking, and destroying enemy forces. And in the White House Situation Room, President George W. Bush was signing off on the air campaign that would reshape the war, Operation Enduring Freedom. The Taliban had made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought in terms of ground warfare, trenches, ambushes, mountain passes. The Americans thought in terms of networks, nodes, and technological overmatch. The Taliban prepared to fight the last war. The Americans were about to wage a war unlike anything the world had seen, a war where the sky itself became a weapon, where an enemy could be obliterated without ever seeing the face of his killer. Mullah Omar believed he was preparing for an invasion. What was coming was an execution from the heavens, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it would shatter not just his front lines, but his entire understanding of modern warfare. As night fell on October 6, 2001, the Taliban positions were alive with routine. Checkpoints manned, artillery dug in, fighters confident in their prepared defenses. In the war room, commanders finalized plans for repelling an American ground invasion that would never come. And high above, beyond sight and sound, the bombers circled in holding patterns, their crews running final systems checks. The war was about to begin in earnest, but only one side knew it. The B-52 crew compartment was cramped, cold, and vibrating with the constant drone of 8 Pratt and Whitney turbofan engines. Major Rick Lawson had been in the air for 7 hours, refueled twice by KC-135 tankers over Pakistan, and was now holding a racetrack pattern over southern Afghanistan. Through the cockpit windows, there was nothing but darkness and stars. No city lights, no roads, just the prehistoric blackness of a land that had resisted modernity for centuries. But on the instrument before him, Afghanistan was anything but dark. The targeting pod displayed a digital mosaic of heat signatures, vehicle concentrations, and pre-designated coordinates uploaded from CENTCOM. Wrath of God, this is quarterback. Stand by for taskings. The voice crackled through Lawson's headset, originating from an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft orbiting somewhere over the Arabian Sea. Quarterback was the airborne command post coordinating the entire air campaign, a flying nerve center managing dozens of strike aircraft, tankers, and surveillance platforms. Lawson acknowledged and waited. His weapons systems officer, Captain Mike Chun, was already scrolling through the target list on his multi-function display. 32 dams in the bomb bay, each weighing 2,000 pounds, each capable of demolishing a reinforced bunker or vaporizing everything within a 100-foot radius. The targets had been selected weeks earlier by a joint task force of CIA analysts, Air Force intelligence officers, and special operations planners. Using a combination of satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human sources on the ground, they had mapped the Taliban's entire military infrastructure, command posts, ammunition depots, vehicle parks, barracks, communication sites. The list ran to hundreds of targets, prioritized by strategic value. Tonight's mission focused on frontline positions around Kandahar and Mazar-i-Sharif, hardened defenses that had been built up over years of civil war. The goal wasn't just to destroy these positions. It was to demonstrate total air superiority, to psychologically shatter the Taliban's belief in their invincibility. On the ground, Northern Alliance commanders were positioned to observe. General Abdul Rashid Dostum, a brutal warlord who'd switched sides more times than most men change clothes, sat on a ridge overlooking Taliban positions near Mazar-i-Sharif. He had been briefed by CIA operatives embedded with his forces, men with beards, local clothing, and backpacks full of encrypted satellite communications gear. The Americans called themselves Jawbreaker and Tiger, code names for paramilitary teams that had infiltrated Afghanistan within days of 9/11. They carried laser designators, devices that could paint targets with invisible beams, guiding bombs with pinpoint accuracy. Dostum had fought the Soviets, the Mujahideen, the Taliban. He'd seen every kind of weapon the 20th century had to offer, but he'd never seen anything like what the Americans promised was coming. "Tell your men to pull back 2 kilometers, said the CIA officer, a former Delta Force operator who went by Mike. His real name was classified. His face would never appear in any official record. Mike was crouched behind a boulder, aiming an /PQ, one SOFLM laser designator, at a Taliban artillery position 5 kilometers away. Through the thermal optic, he could see fighters moving around Soviet-era D-30 howitzers, completely unaware they were being watched in the sky and the ridgeline. Dostum gave the order in Dari, and his fighters withdrew, confused but obedient. They'd learned to trust the Americans' strange magic, radios that connected to satellites, maps that showed real-time enemy positions, and now, invisible bombers that supposedly could strike with godlike precision. At exactly 2,130 hours, Quarterback gave the order. All strike packages. You are cleared hot. Execute, execute, execute. Lawson pressed the release button. The B-52s shuddered slightly as the bomb bay doors opened and the first JDM fell free, its guidance fins deploying microseconds later. The bomb didn't scream or whistle. It fell in near silence, its trajectory continuously adjusted by GPS satellites orbiting in space, its target coordinates refined by the laser designation from Mike SOFLM on the ridge. It took 43 seconds to fall from release altitude to impact. In that time, 12 more bombers released their payloads across a 200-kilometer front. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from Navy destroyers in the Arabian Sea, were simultaneously converging on air defense sites and command bunkers. And on the ridgelines, Special Forces teams prepared to call in additional strikes as targets of opportunity emerged. The first bomb hit the Taliban artillery position at 2,131 hours. The explosion was biblical, a flash of white light that turned night into day, followed by a concussive blast wave that flattened everything within 200 meters. The D-30 howitzers, each weighing 3 tons, were tossed like toys. Ammunition cooked off in secondary explosions, sending tracers spiraling into the sky. The fighters standing near the guns simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the overpressure. On the ridge, even 2 kilometers away, Dostum's men felt the heat and shock wave. Some dropped to the ground instinctively. Others stared in awe and terror. Allahu Akbar, Dostum whispered, not in defiance, but in pure astonishment. Mike was already adjusting his designator to the next target, a command post built into a hillside cave. Within seconds, another B-52 released its payload. This time, it was a blue 109 bunker buster, a hardened penetrator designed to punch through reinforced concrete before detonating. The bomb disappeared into the cave entrance and detonated underground. The entire hillside seemed to heave upward, then collapse inward as the cave system imploded. Dust and debris shot out of every fissure, and opening like volcanic vents. Across the Taliban front lines, the same scene repeated in dozens of locations simultaneously. Near Kabul, an ammunition depot exploded with such force that the flash was visible from 50 kilometers away. North of Kandahar, a convoy of Taliban reinforcements, trucks carrying fighters and heavy weapons, was caught in the open on a desert highway. An AC-130 gunship, circling overhead with infrared sensors and side-mounted cannons, systematically destroyed every vehicle in the convoy. The 105mm howitzer aboard the AC-130 fired with mechanical precision, each round guided by computer-assisted targeting. The trucks exploded one after another, like firecrackers on a string. Survivors who fled into the desert were tracked by the gunship sensors, their heat signatures glowing white against the cold ground. In Kandahar, Mullah Omar's compound shook from the distant explosions. The supreme leader emerged from his quarters to find his commanders in chaos. Radio communications were breaking down. Repeater stations and transmission towers were being systematically destroyed. Reports flooding and were incoherent, panicked. Our positions are gone. The bunkers collapsed. We can't see the planes. Where are they firing from? One commander, his voice cracking over a satellite phone, reported that an entire battalion-strength position had been obliterated in less than 10 minutes. 400 men, dozens of vehicles, artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, all gone. No warning, no chance to respond, no enemy to shoot back at. Omar stood in the courtyard, staring at the horizon lit by distant fires. For the first time in his life, he felt something unfamiliar: doubt. The Soviets had bombed Afghanistan relentlessly, but their bombs had been dumb, unguided iron that could be evaded, survived, outlasted. This was different. This was surgical, total, inescapable. The Americans weren't invading Afghanistan. They were erasing it from above, rewriting the battlefield without ever setting foot on it. The mountains, the terrain, the fortified positions. None of it mattered. The enemy could simply delete your forces from 8 miles up. By midnight, the first wave of strikes was complete. 37 B-52 sorties, 18 F/A, 18 strikes from carrier groups, 50 Tomahawk missiles, and uncounted AC-130 gunship runs. The Taliban had lost an estimated 30% of their frontline combat power in a single night. But more devastating than the physical destruction was the psychological impact. Survivors emerged from collapsed bunkers and burning positions with the same look, shell-shocked, broken, their confidence shattered. They had thought they were fighting an invasion. Instead, they'd experienced annihilation from an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight back against. The invisible armada had spoken, and the message was clear. This war would be fought on America's terms, with America's technology, and there was no mountain high enough to hide from it. Dawn broke over the Afghan desert with an eerie silence. The morning after the bombing campaign began, Taliban fighters emerged from caves and bunkers to find their world transformed into a landscape of craters and twisted metal. Where artillery positions had stood, there were now smoking pits 30 feet deep. Trenches that had taken months to dig were collapsed, buried under tons of displaced earth. Vehicles were blackened husks, ammunition depots still smoldering with secondary fires that would burn for days. And everywhere, the smell, cordite, burning fuel, and something worse that no one wanted to name. Commander Hafiz Majid, a veteran of the Soviet War who'd fought in every major Taliban campaign since 1994, stood at what remained his forward operating position north of Kandahar. Of the 300 men under his command, he could account for perhaps 200. The rest were dead, wounded, or had deserted during the night, fleeing into the desert when the bombing started. His communications equipment was destroyed. The radio truck had taken a direct hit, vaporized along with his signals team. He had no contact with higher command, no way to coordinate with adjacent units, no intelligence on enemy movements. For all practical purposes, his unit had ceased to exist as a fighting force. "What do we do?" asked the second-in-command, a young fighter named Rashid who joined the Taliban only 6 months earlier, drawn by religious fervor and promises of glory. Now Rashid's hands trembled as he tried to light a cigarette, his eyes darting to the sky every few seconds, searching for threats he couldn't see. Majid had no answer. Every tactical doctrine he'd learned, every lesson from the Soviet War, was useless. The Soviets could be ambushed, their helicopters shot down with stingers, their convoys destroyed with mines and RPGs. But how do you ambush an enemy you can't see? How do you shoot down a bomber flying higher than any weapon you possess can reach? The bombing continued through the day, though at a reduced pace. The Americans were conducting what military planners called shaping operations, systematically destroying Taliban combat power, logistics, and command infrastructure before committing ground forces. AC-130 gunships hunted for targets of opportunity, their sensors detecting any vehicle movement, any concentration of fighters. Taliban units that tried to reposition were caught in the open and destroyed. Those that stayed in place were hit by precision strikes called in by special forces teams infiltrated throughout the country. The Taliban were learning a harsh lesson. In modern warfare, movement meant death, and staying still meant death. There was no third option. In Mazar-i-Sharif, the Taliban's northern stronghold, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The city was strategically vital. Whoever controlled Mazar controlled the Uzbekistan border and the vital supply routes from Central Asia. The Taliban had held the city since 1998, when they'd massacred thousands of Hazara civilians in ethnic cleansing campaigns. Now, with their defenses shattered by airstrikes, they face a Northern Alliance offensive supported by American air power. General Dassam's cavalry, yes, actual horsemen, a surreal sight in the 21st century, were advancing across the Dasht-e-Lili Desert, supported by pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns. And above them, providing what the military called CIS, close air support, were American F divided by a -18S, a 10 Warthogs, and B-52s ready to drop bombs on coordinates designated by forward air controllers riding alongside Dostum's forces. The Battle of Mazar-i-Sharif became a strange hybrid of ancient and modern warfare. Northern Alliance cavalry would charge Taliban positions on horseback, a tactic that hadn't been used in major warfare since World War II. When they encountered resistance, they'd pull back and call in air strikes. Minutes later, a B-52 would release a JDM that would obliterate the Taliban defensive position. Then the cavalry would charge again, overrunning the stunned survivors. Taliban fighters, many of them foreign jihadists from Chechnya, Pakistan, and the Arab world, found themselves in a nightmarish scenario. Attacked by horsemen like it was the 19th century, then bombed by invisible aircraft using 21st century precision weapons. Their morale collapsed almost as quickly as their defenses. CIA officer Mike watched the battle unfold from a ridge, communicating with the AWACS controller via satellite radio. Quarterback, this is Tiger 2-1. Northern Alliance is taking fire from compound at grid Whiskey Echo 749er. Request immediate CS. Danger close. Friendlies marked by infrared strobe. The response came within seconds. Tiger 2-1. Hammer 4-1 inbound. 30 seconds. Confirm friendlies clear. Mike relayed the warning in Dari to Dostum's commanders, who pulled their men back 200 meters. The F/A-18, call sign Hammer 4-1, rolled in from 12,000 feet and released a single GBU, 12-payway laser-guided bomb. The weapon, guided by Mike's laser designator, hit the compound's main structure dead center. The building disintegrated, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing but rubble and silence. Back in Kandahar, Mullah Omar convened an emergency shura, a council of senior Taliban leadership, in a bunker complex that had, so far, avoided destruction. The mood was grim. Reports from every front were catastrophic. The northern defenses were collapsing. Supply lines were cut. Communications were fragmentary at best. Worst of all, morale was breaking. Taliban fighters, who'd been told they were invincible holy warriors protected by Allah, were deserting in growing numbers. Some fled to Pakistan. Others simply went home to their villages, discarding weapons and uniforms along the way. The vaunted Arab and Pakistani foreign fighters, Al-Qaeda's Brigade 055, were particularly affected. These men had come to Afghanistan expecting to fight in a glorious jihad, not to be incinerated from the sky without ever seeing their enemy. We must withdraw to the mountains, argued Mullah Dadullah. We cannot fight them in the open. We move to Tora Bora, to the Paktia caves, to the tribal areas. We become invisible, as we did with the Soviets. We make them come to us. It was a sound tactical proposal, a return to guerrilla warfare fundamentals. But it also represented an acknowledgement of defeat. The Taliban would no longer be a conventional fighting force holding territory, but an insurgency hiding in the mountains, hoping to outlast American patience. Omar knew that accepting the strategy meant losing power, losing legitimacy, losing everything they'd built since 1996. But what choice did they have? Standing and fighting meant annihilation. The decision was made. The Taliban would abandon most cities and frontline positions, withdraw into mountainous regions, and prepare for protracted insurgency. It was presented as a strategic redeployment, but everyone in the bunker knew the truth. It was a rout, barely controlled, a desperate attempt to preserve some fighting force for the future. Orders went out to commanders in the field. Fall back, disperse, hide weapons caches, blend into the population. Some units received these orders and complied. Others never got the message. Their communication networks destroyed and were overrun by Northern Alliance forces supported by American air power. On October 19, 2001, just 12 days after the bombing campaign began, Mazar-i-Sharif fell to Northern Alliance forces. Taliban defenders who hadn't fled were killed or captured. The foreigners, Arabs, Chechens, Pakistanis, fought to the death, knowing they'd receive no mercy. The locals, Afghan Taliban, often tried to surrender or slip away into the population. Dostum's forces were sometimes merciful, sometimes not. Hundreds of prisoners were crammed into shipping containers and transported across the desert. Many suffocated in the heat, their bodies discovered days later when the containers were opened. It was a war crime that barely made the news, overshadowed by the rapid Taliban collapse across the country. Within weeks, Kabul fell, then Kandahar was surrounded. The movement that had ruled Afghanistan with brutal religious authority for 5 years was disintegrating. Mullah Omar fled Kandahar on a motorcycle, accompanied by a handful of bodyguards, disappearing into the mountains of Helmand province. He would remain in hiding for the rest of his life, issuing occasional statements, becoming more myth than man. His regime was finished, but the war was far from over. The Taliban's decision to abandon conventional warfare and embrace insurgency would shape the next 20 years. The Americans had won the initial battle through overwhelming technological superiority, but they were about to learn that you can't defeat an idea with bombs, and that controlling Afghanistan requires more than air superiority. The Taliban survivors melted into the population, buried their weapons, and waited. They had learned their lesson. Don't fight the Americans in the open. Don't concentrate forces. Don't use radios or vehicles that can be tracked. Become invisible, patient, implacable. The Americans thought they'd won. The Taliban knew they'd simply changed tactics. The real war was just beginning. Major Rick Lawson returned to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana in early December 2001, his B-52 having flown 37 combat sorties over Afghanistan. He dropped more ordnance than any previous deployment in his career, participated in what Air Force commanders were calling the most successful strategic bombing campaign since Desert Storm. But sitting in the post-mission debriefing at CENTCOM headquarters, listening to intelligence officers present PowerPoint slides on Taliban combat power degradation and kinetic effects analysis, Lawson felt a growing unease. The numbers were impressive. 85% of fixed Taliban positions destroyed, their conventional military capabilities effectively eliminated. But what did that actually mean? The war in Afghanistan had demonstrated something revolutionary and disturbing. America could now wage war almost entirely from a distance, with minimal risk to its own forces, using technology to compensate for the political intolerance of casualties. In those first months, fewer than a dozen U.S. combat deaths occurred, while Taliban and al-Qaeda losses numbered in the thousands. It was the most one-sided military campaign in modern history. But this asymmetry came with hidden costs that wouldn't become apparent for years. At Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, a new type of warrior was emerging, the drone pilot. Captain Sarah Mendez sat in a climate-controlled trailer 9,000 miles from Afghanistan, operating an MQ-1 Predator drone via satellite link. Her cockpit consisted of computer monitors, joysticks, and the surreal experience of hunting targets in Afghanistan during the day, then driving home to Las Vegas to have dinner with her family at night. She could watch Taliban fighters in real time through the Predator's infrared camera, track their movements, their patterns, their daily routines. And when authorized, she could fire a AGM-114 Hellfire missile, watch the explosion on her screen, then clock out and go home. The entire experience mediated through technology, sanitized of blood and screaming. The Predator program expanded rapidly. What began as a surveillance platform quickly evolved into a strike weapon. By 2002, armed drones were conducting regular, targeted killing operations against high-value Taliban and al-Qaeda targets. The criteria for strikes became increasingly permissive. Initially, drone strikes required presidential approval. Within 2 years, they could be authorized by theater commanders. By the mid-2000s, CIA drone operators were conducting signature strikes, targeting individuals based on behavioral patterns and statistical models, without even knowing their identities. A group of military-age males gathered in a compound in Waziristan, potential militants. A funeral procession for a known insurgent, secondary target opportunity. The technology enabled a kind of industrialized assassination that would have been impossible and possibly unthinkable in any previous war. Back in Afghanistan, the Taliban adapted. They stopped using radios and cell phones, communicating instead through human couriers. They dispersed their forces, never gathering in groups large enough to warrant an airstrike. They hid among civilians, knowing American rules of engagement required positive identification of military targets before engaging. They planted IEDs, improvised explosive devices. The poor man's Air Force, a weapon that couldn't be stopped by technological superiority, that cost $20 to make and thousands to defeat. And most importantly, they waited. They understood something fundamental about asymmetric warfare. They didn't need to win battles. They just needed to not lose. Every year the Americans stayed was a political victory for the Taliban, proof that the occupiers couldn't pacify the country, couldn't leave, couldn't truly win. CIA analyst Jennifer Watkins worked in the Counterterrorism Center at Langley, Virginia, managing a database of suspected Taliban and al-Qaeda operatives. Her job was to build link analysis networks, mapping relationships between individuals, identifying high-value targets, feeding coordinates to drone operators and special operations teams. She was good at her job, meticulous, responsible for dozens of successful strikes. But over the years, she began noticing disturbing patterns in the data. For every Taliban commander killed, 2 more emerged. Villages that were pacified one year became insurgent strongholds the next. The metrics showed progress. Enemy killed, weapons seized, districts secured. But the war never seemed to actually end. It was like fighting smoke. One incident haunted her. In 2008, her analysis had identified a compound in Helmand province as a Taliban command center. The drone feed showed multiple military-age males, weapons visible, meeting patterns consistent with tactical planning. She provided the coordinates. A JDM was dropped. The compound was destroyed. Mission success. 3 days later, Reuters published photos from the site. Wedding party. 23 civilians dead, including the bride and groom. The intelligence had been wrong. The weapons were ceremonial AK-47s, a tradition at Pashtun weddings. The meeting pattern was guests arriving for a celebration. The Pentagon issued a statement expressing regret, calling it a tragic mistake, promising improved targeting procedures. But Jennifer knew the truth. The system was designed for efficiency, not certainty. When you're killing from 9,000 miles away, everyone looks like a target on a screen. By 2010, the United States had been in Afghanistan longer than the Soviet Union had. The initial justification, destroying al-Qaeda and punishing the Taliban for harboring them, had been accomplished within months. Osama bin Laden was dead, killed in Pakistan in 2011 by SEAL Team 6. Al-Qaeda as an organization was functionally destroyed, scattered across multiple countries, no longer capable of planning and executing major attacks. But the war continued. The mission evolved from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency, from destroying al-Qaeda to nation-building in Afghanistan, training an Afghan army and police force, establishing a democratic government. The goalposts kept moving, and with each evolution, the war became less winnable and more expensive, in dollars, in lives, in political capital. Lieutenant Daniel Ortega, a 10th Mountain Division platoon leader, understood the gap between the war as seen from Washington and the war's experience in Afghan villages. His unit conducted patrols in Khyber province, ostensibly to provide security and support the Afghan government. But every patrol was a target. IEDs buried in roads, snipers in the hills, potential ambushes around every corner. The Afghan civilians they were supposed to be protecting were often Taliban supporters, or at minimum, hedging their bets, helping whoever had power at the moment. American technology meant nothing on these patrols. Drones overhead, radios, body armor, night vision. None of it prevented an IED from detonating under your Humvee. None of it stopped a bullet from a sniper you never saw. The Taliban couldn't win conventional battle. But they didn't need to. They just needed to outlast American will. The war's fundamental contradiction became clear. America could win every tactical engagement, kill every Taliban fighter encountered, drop a bomb on any target it chose, but couldn't create a stable, functional Afghan government, couldn't eliminate the underlying conditions that produce insurgencies, couldn't make the Afghan population want what Washington wanted them to want. The doctrine of distance, the belief that technology could substitute for political engagement and cultural understanding, proved inadequate. You can't drone strike your way to victory in a civil war. You can't build a nation from 40,000 feet. By 2021, after 20 years, $3 trillion, and over 170,000 deaths, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. Within weeks, the Afghan government collapsed, the army melted away, and the Taliban retook Kabul almost without a fight. The scenes at Kabul airport, desperate Afghans clinging to departing C-17s, some falling to their deaths as the planes took off, became the war's defining images. All that technology, all that firepower, all those precision strikes, and the outcome was the same as if none of it had happened. The Taliban were back in power, older but still led by many of the same commanders who'd survived that first bombing campaign in 2001. Mullah Omar never lived to see this outcome. He died in 2013 of tuberculosis, still in hiding, still issuing defiant statements. But his strategic insight proved correct. The Americans were unwilling to endure a long war, unwilling to accept the casualties and costs of truly occupying Afghanistan, unwilling to commit to the generational project that stabilizing the country would have required. The B-52s could erase his front lines in a single night, could destroy his army, could kill his commanders. But they couldn't defeat the idea that Afghanistan belonged to Afghans, not foreign occupiers, no matter how technologically advanced. The War on Terror, as it came to be called, established a new American way of war, remote, technologically mediated, sold to the public as clean and precise, but in reality producing a forever war of drone strikes, special operations raids, and proxy forces, a war without clear victory conditions or end states. The doctrine of distance meant American casualties were minimal, which meant public opposition was manageable, which meant the war could continue indefinitely without political consequences. It was warfare as background noise, as foreign policy on autopilot, as a strategic commitment that outlasted for presidential administrations without ever achieving its stated objectives. In a bunker somewhere in the Afghan mountains, the day after U.S. forces completed their withdrawal, a Taliban commander, a man who'd been 15 years old when those first bombs fell in 2001, who'd spent his entire adult life fighting Americans, gave a speech to his men. They came with their planes, their drones, their satellites, he said. They killed many of us. They destroyed our positions, but they couldn't destroy our will. They couldn't make us surrender. And in the end, they left and we're still here. He was right. The most powerful military in human history, capable of projecting devastating force anywhere on Earth, have been outlasted by men with rifles and patience. The age of drone eyes and distant wars had begun that night in October 2001, but it hadn't ended the way anyone expected.